This is the Retirement Lifestyle Advocates radio program. I am your host, Dennis Tubbegren. Glad you decided to tune in once again today. Hey, if you're a new listener, welcome. This is where we talk about what's going on today in finance, in the financial markets, and in the economy. And we look at those through the lens of history. And I want to do that in this first segment today. Because your history teacher was right. Those who don't study history are doomed to repeat it. And it appears, at least from my opinion and from the opinion of some of the guests here I have on the program, that we are on the road to repeating history. That'll be my topic of this first segment. Then in the second and third segments of today's program, I'll be joined by Mr. Jeffrey Tucker. Jeffrey Tucker is the editorial director for the American Institute for Economic Research. He has a brand new book out we'll talk to him about. The title, Liberty or Lockdown. I think that given that there's been some changes of opinion as to the reaction and response to the COVID-19 situation, that certainly getting Jeffrey's perspective today will be interesting and I believe helpful. Before I get to my topic, though, I want to remind you that if you have not yet downloaded the Retirement Lifestyle Advocates app, you can go to retirementlifestyleadvocates.com, and there are instructions there as to how to download the app. The app now can be downloaded more simply. We are working on making some additional revisions to make it super easy to download. But when you go download the app, you will get access to a bunch of free resources that are designed to be helpful. In fact, what I'm going to talk to you about here in this segment, I talked about on my update webinar with clients that is available through the app this past week. You also, via the app, will be able to get the podcast that I produce every week. And you will also be able to get the free Portfolio Watch newsletter that is also distributed every week. So go to retirementlifestyleadvocates.com. Download the app if you've not already done so. You know, it's no secret that the Federal Reserve, the central bank of the United States, and if you're a new listener, the Federal Reserve is a private group. It's a private group of bankers. And back in 1913, in December, to be exact, the United States thought it made sense to give control of monetary policy to private bankers. So the Federal Reserve, since March of this year, has created, literally out of thin air, more than $3 trillion. And just to put that into perspective, that's the total amount of money that was created from 2008 to 2020, and it happened this year in a matter of months. Now, there are a number of side effects that you're likely going to see as a result of money printing, and in particular, continued money printing, and we've discussed those on past programs. As we talk about where I want to go in this segment, the words of the late economist Herbert Stein come to mind. Mr. Stein very profoundly and simply stated that if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. Isn't that profound? Well, that's certainly true of money creation as well. You can't simply print forever, and there are a number of historical examples, one of which we'll talk about today in this segment. Now, when the money printing stops, which it will, we have to have a reset. Now, that reset can either be reactive or it can be proactive. Now, there are a number of recent examples of reactive resets. We've talked about Zimbabwe here on the program. Zimbabwe, under the leadership of Mugabe, actually abandoned the Zimbabwe dollar and adopted U.S. dollars instead once total confidence in the currency was lost. That is a reactive reset. The same thing happened in Weimar Germany. The same thing happened during the Roman Empire, and although the way the currency was debased, although the way the money printing occurred changed slightly based on the type of currency that was in use at the time, the end result is they all look very much alike. Now, if we go back 300 years, there was a gentleman by the name of John Law, a Scotsman who was the central banker of France. This was in the early 1700s, and the story as to how John Law became France's central banker is an interesting side note as well that I do not have time to talk about in this segment. But he was appointed to this position by the regent of France, who was actually in charge of running the country of France after Louis XIV died, and Louis XV took over. And when Louis XV took over, he was 7 years old. And, of course, we couldn't have a 7-year-old running the country, although it may be a worthy experiment. But I digress. At that time, France was deeply in debt, and Louis XIV was a very popular king. He was very popular because he gave away a lot of free stuff, and in the process of giving away free stuff to the population, which certainly led to his popularity, it created a lot of debt. Well, at the time, coins containing precious metal were being used as currency, and Louis XIV died. John Law is now in charge, and the regent and John Law had to figure out how to pay down this debt. And they have the same three choices, or had the same three choices, I should say, in the early 1700s as politicians have today. They can raise taxes, they can cut spending, or they can print money. But when the debt numbers get too big, when it's impossible to pay down the debt by raising taxes, and cutting spending would be extremely draconian and politically unpopular, politicians historically have always resorted to the same choice, and that is printing currency. And that's exactly what happened in France in the early 1700s under John Law. Now, they didn't create money digitally then like we do today. What they did was debase the coinage, and this was not a new idea. This is an idea they borrowed from the Roman Empire. Newly minted coins contain precious metal content that was 20% less than coins minted previously. Well, the French citizens were no dummies. They decided to hoard the coins, so the government made hoarding the coins illegal. Well, John Law had a great idea. He said, let's issue some paper money, some paper notes, and guarantee that this paper money could be exchanged at any time for the coins containing precious metals. This really happened in the United States with silver certificates. That ended back in the late 60s, and the gold backing of the dollar ended in 71. So this all happened about 50 years ago here. Well, paper money's a lot easier to use than coins, so people began to use the paper money, and it didn't take long for most of the coins to come out of circulation. So eventually, the paper currency was all that circulated. Well, Law decided to continue to print money, and it was a boom for a period of time. Luxury items were flying off the shelf. Real estate prices were booming because money printing does create the illusion of prosperity. But as always happens, a tipping point was reached. Some of the French citizens began to lose confidence in the paper money, and eventually the financial system collapsed. Now, there were a number of events that took place, but the bottom line is this: that is a reactionary reset. And 100% of the time, historically, from my research, whenever the reset occurs, tangible assets are good things to own. And if you've not yet downloaded the app, I would encourage you to do that because there's a lot of resources there that can help you. If you're just joining me, go to retirementlifestyleadvocates.com and download the app. You'll get more information about adding tangible assets to your portfolio and see if it might be right for you. I will be back after these words with Jeffrey Tucker. Welcome back to RLA Radio. I am your host, Dennis Tubbegren. Joining me on today's program is returning guest, Mr. Jeffrey Tucker. Jeffrey is the editorial director for the American Institute for Economic Research. He is also a prolific author with really too many titles to mention in a brief introduction. However, his most recent book is titled Liberty or Lockdown. It was just released about 3 weeks ago. And Jeffrey, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
So, Jeffrey, tell us about your book, Liberty or Lockdown, and congratulations on another terrific book.
Well, I'd rather there be not lockdowns than write a book, but if I had to trade, I'd glad to get rid of my book and get back normal rights and freedoms like we had in January. I'm absolutely astonished to be living in the times in which we live. I never thought that in the United States we would suddenly shut down by force Broadway, churches, movies, sports, travel, schools, much less impose house arrest on most people and enforce it with criminal penalties. If you'd told me that in January, I would have thought you were out of your mind. So it's a bit of a shock, and I hope we learn a lesson from it, which is, if I was going to summarize my lesson, it would be never do it again.
So, Jeffrey, when you look at just how this whole year has evolved, we'll look at it just from a health perspective. Even the WHO recently came out and said, these lockdowns were a mistake. I mean, that's really not unanimous, but it's getting pretty close. So, why do we still have all these restrictions in many states, including the state in which I live, Michigan?
Dennis, I think part of it is that the politicians are afraid to admit that they made a mistake, and they think that if they unlock down, then it's an implicit admission that what they did was wrong, and the kids have suffered, the poor have suffered, the working class has suffered, everybody's in shock. People, according to politicians, they think that the people need to believe it was for some good reason. And if they just suddenly unlock everything, it would be an implicit admission that they made a mistake. And there's something funny about politicians. Most of us make mistakes in life, and we're encouraged not to. We're encouraged to admit it, and move on. I think that's hard, but we do. For some reason, that seems to be against the constitution of politicians. So they keep doubling down with fake science and that sort of thing to try to justify it, but it's getting very difficult now. The Great Barrington Declaration, which took place in my offices here just last weekend, actually, incredibly, featured 8,000 scientists led by the three top epidemiologists in the world, Bhattacharya, Sumetra Gupta, and Martin Kulldorff. Saying these lockdowns were a huge mistake. We need to go back within our normal lives again. And that's what pushed the World Health Organization to change its mind.
So, Jeffrey, when you look at, just historical precedent, and I know you're a student of history, has anything like this ever happened before, to your knowledge?
Nothing even close to this has ever happened before. We've had terrible calamities in world history, but they've always been more or less localized or regionalized, but never a global calamity on this level. Universal lockdowns, and nothing like this has ever happened. This is not normal. It's completely unprecedented. And the people who claim that it had to happen because the virus is so bad. Well, even if the virus were as bad as they're saying, which it turns out they're not, the average age of death is 82 with 2.6 comorbidities. Only 94% of the people who have died with COVID actually died from COVID exclusively. And so it's far less lethal than the seasonal flu for healthy people under the age of 60. Nothing like this has ever happened, and I think part of what my book does is try to figure out exactly why this happened. As you might imagine, the answer is complicated because it's such a disaster that it's not just one reason. It was a confluence of events that came together over the course of 15 years, I would say. that finally led to it. And the lockdowners were organized, and the rest of us weren't, and it just took us by surprise. I think a lot of people probably in many places, in Michigan, around the country, are just now waking up to what actually happened to us, and that it was completely futile and all for naught, and all the destruction and suffering we've undergone has been for no reason whatsoever. Lockdowns didn't save a single life, not one.
You know, Jeffrey, and it's interesting, I think, how the media has covered this entire coronavirus situation going all the way back to January. How would you characterize the way that most media has covered this whole event as it's played out?
Well, it's a complete shock. February 27th, the New York Times did a podcast in which they predicted 6.6 million Americans would die unless we're locked down. That day, I realized something had gone very wrong, because I'm a big fan of the New York Times. I love that podcast, and I realized something had gone very, very wrong. And so I shut it down. I just didn't want to hear this nonsense anymore, but I was bracing myself for lockdown as a result of that day, because I know how the American media works. What they do is follow the New York Times. The New York Times was hysterical, ghastly, and awful on the subject, so everybody just followed in line, and the media has cheered the lockdowns all along. And partially the reason is the media benefits from lockdowns, and also they're filled with ignorant reporters who know absolutely nothing about immunology or viruses. And also, there's a strange way in which this disease has been politicized. I saw a poll the other day asking Republicans, are you ready to get back to regular life? And 60% said yes. Asked Democrats, and 2% said yes. So there's a huge political agenda behind these lockdowns, which is deeply tragic. And to me, that shows why we should never, ever turn over disease mitigation to politicians.
Well, I certainly would second that motion. Can we dig into that a little bit more, the political gap, if you will? Because, that gap, I think, particularly between rabid Republicans and rabid Democrats has never been greater. Can you elaborate a little bit as to why you think that it's 2% of the Democrats that are ready to get back to normal everyday life, and 60% of Republicans? To what do you attribute that big gap?
It's a little bit complicated, but I think it has something to do with the fact that the Democrats were getting desperate to defeat Trump. They tried the Russia thing, it didn't work. They tried the Ukraine impeachment thing, it didn't work. And this was their third chance.
So let's talk a little bit about how you see things playing out moving ahead. I mean, when this relates to your book as well. And I should mention, if you're just joining us, I'm chatting today with Mr. Jeffrey Tucker. Jeffrey is the editorial director for the American Institute of Economic Research. He is also the author of the newly released book, Liberty or Lockdown. So, moving ahead, it seems that lockdowns are still being discussed as a way to prevent the spread of COVID-19. If these things don't work, why are they still being considered, not just in the United States and certain states, but all around the world?
It has to do with something like an intuition. People think that a disease is spread by people, and if we just keep people apart, then we'll stop the disease. The problem is that there's no end game. Even if that were true, and there's actually no evidence that that's actually true, because it turns out you can't have a society without people being around each other, without showing each other's faces and that sort of thing. We've evolved over 1 million years to integrate viruses into our human community, and we know how that works, and we know what to do about it. So this is a kind of a medieval attitude towards disease. That's one thing. The politicians are afraid to admit error. There also is a kind of I think it's undeniable that there's a kind of a get Trump sort of feeling behind these lockdowns, that the more misery that they can promote, the more people are going to want to vote for some kind of change. But the problem is, that's actually not working out very well either, because the Democrats are favoring lockdowns, and I'm not a very political person, but it seems to me that based on what I've heard, voting for the Democratic Party right now means that you perpetuate the misery, not get rid of it. So I'm not sure it's going to work for them politically. I'm not a political expert, but I'm not seeing the evidence. I see tens of thousands of people clamoring to go to Republican rallies and Democrats having to pay people to be there. So I'm just not sure. It looks like a repeat of 2016 to me. There's going to be hell to pay, Dennis. There is going to be. We cannot, as a country, we have a constitution, we have a Bill of Rights. This is the country, land of the free, home of the brave. And it's not hospitable to lockdowns. This is not China. China, which, by the way, is entirely open. China, which has state propaganda on the television and radio right now, telling people to gather in groups, telling people to go to the movies, telling people to go to the malls. They're trying to get people out and about and unafraid of the disease. Our country is almost completely the opposite. When Trump said we need to learn to live with the virus, get brave, get bold, get immunity, he was jeered down and even had his tweets deleted by Twitter. So we've got now the big tech companies censoring the government. Did you ever imagine a time when it would be like that? I always thought censorship was government censoring tech companies. I didn't expect it to be the opposite.
So when you look at the economic impact of lockdowns, and I'm sure you talk about it in your book, how do you see things playing out from here? Are you among those that think we're going to have a V-shaped recovery, an L-shaped recovery, a K-shaped recovery? How do you see things playing out moving ahead?
Dennis, a lot appears in what we do right now. If we had ended these lockdowns back, say, first week of April, I would have expected that the free market would have bounced back really, really quickly. But dragging on all this time, I think it's been devastating. More than 100,000 businesses by now, 150,000 businesses have been closed. Broadway is devastated. The arts, museums are shutting down. Kids are ruined. We've lost confidence. And investment and prosperity is all about confidence in the future. That seems to have gone away because now people don't know anymore if their businesses are going to be taken away from them. In New York, even now, 2/3 of the bars have shut. I can't believe I'm saying these things to you, by the way. The restaurants, you still can't go have indoor dining because the politicians know where the virus is and they think it's somehow indoors on the tables, International trade has been devastated. Supply chains shattered. The hospitality industry ruined. Embassies and consulates around the world are still closed. You can't go to Paris. Paris can't come to us. I don't see how we're not going to enter into a huge depression, even if we open up right now. And I think the consequences are very, very far-reaching. Monetary policy, fiscal policy, as I say, confidence in the future, investor confidence in the future. I don't know how this stuff comes back. I think a lot depends on if we get a universal apology from all politicians and bureaucrats and public health officials tomorrow, where they say this is a huge disaster, will never happen again, I think we could come back from it. Lacking that, I'm not so sure.
Well, we're chatting today with Mr. Jeffrey Tucker. He is the editorial director for the American Institute for Economic Research. His most recent book is Liberty or Lockdown. And I'll continue my conversation with Jeffrey when RLA Radio returns. Stay with us. I am Dennis Tubbegren. You are listening to RLA Radio. I'm chatting today with Mr. Jeffrey Tucker. Jeffrey is the author of the newly released book, Liberty or Lockdown, and he is also the editorial director for the American Institute for Economic Research. And Jeffrey, before we jump back in, for our listeners maybe that are not familiar with the American Institute for Economic Research, can you just fill them in a bit on what you guys do?
Sure. We were founded in 1933 to support and research functioning markets and to do deeper research independent of academia and government and large corporate interests. That's our mission, and we've been doing it for 87 years. So right now, actually, Dennis, it's an extraordinary thing. I'm dealing with this constantly. Last weekend, we had three top epidemiological scientists in-house and recorded some videos, and they released a statement about it. And there's a big lobby out there for lockdowns, and they've been coming after us relentlessly on Wikipedia, left-wing news all over the place. They claim that we're a right-wing, Koch-funded outfit that is corrupt. We want old people to die so we can take their money. I mean, the amount of smears and attacks on the American Institute for Economic Research, which has 87 years of integrity in research and in economics behind it, is absolutely shocking. And on the internet, you can say anything you want. But, I'm dealing with this stuff all weekend. I would like to have a couple of days off, even an hour off every once in a while. But nope, can't do it because the smears are coming in incredibly. And it's because the American Institute for Economic Research was influential in getting the World Health Organization to change its policies from lockdown to freedom. And the lockdowners are furious at us. And I tell you, the attacks have just begun. And it's really tragic and pointless. And this situation, when the mob comes after you, like it's coming after us right now, you really don't know what to do. You just have to kind of keep telling the truth and get strong and get louder, and that's what we're doing.
So, Jeffrey, when the World Health Organization changes its position, what groups or individuals or both comprise the group that you call lockdowners? That would be an interesting question in my view.
Well, it is a fascinating question, and I have to tell you, I myself have gotten an education in this. So, Dennis, you know that the academy, by which I mean universities and colleges, have been drifting left for quite some time, decades really. But over the last 10 to 15 years, we've seen the rise of intersectionality, class theory, and critical theory, and basically left-wing Marxism in the social sciences and humanities, to the point that they have something like an 80 to 90% domination, meaning that the students who go to school get fed non-stop propaganda in these disciplines, and then some select few of those go on to get their graduate degrees and then PhDs and go back into teaching. And so then they keep feeding on each other, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. What's remarkable is that they've been trying over the last 10 years to figure out some way to make inroads into science, into natural science, and into other disciplines, so they can bring their Marxist outlook to them. It turns out that the idea of public health is a kind of bridge between the humanities or sociology and the hard sciences. So if you get a degree in something like there's a big commentator on television right now, she got a degree in museum anthropology, and she's head of public health at the University of Edinburgh. And so she's all over the press in the EU speaking about scientific questions, but she knows nothing about science, never studied it, doesn't care anything about it. She's basically an agenda-driven Marxist. There's another guy who's been attacking us recently who is a journalist who got his PhD in political economy or political science, but imagines himself to be a public health expert again, never having taken a class in medicine or sciences at all. And he's got a political agenda. So all these people have a political agenda, and they're passing themselves off as public health experts, and the media is glad to give them a platform. What they want is a shutdown of capitalism, a shutdown of freedom, and a closing of travel, the end of industrial civilization. I'm not exaggerating. It's what they want. And lockdowns for them are the tool to get it. You recall that before the lockdowns began, we were dealing with this thing called the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal imagined that, AOC, this congressperson, was promoting the abolition of air travel because it used fossil fuels. She wanted to shut down trains and cars and go back to some sort of primitive lifestyle. And now she's getting her way. Lockdowns mean she gets her way. And it's the same thing, I must tell you, with a certain head of National Institutes of Health, Anthony Fauci, who just 3 weeks ago wrote an article saying we're going to have to end all mass sporting events, cities. He doesn't think you should be allowed to own pets, dogs and cats. He's coming for your kitties. And these people are crazy people. They're crazy people, but they're very well organized. And, I knew they were out there. I wrote about them 15 years ago. But I never imagined they would get that critical balance of power in order to actually implement this nightmare dystopia that they put us under today. And I think it was just a combination of events. It was the rise of Marxism and critical theory and the humanities bleeding over to the natural sciences through public health, combined with a politically driven political class that really wants to get Trump and increase misery on the American people so we'll vote him out of office. And then also tech companies and media companies that are frankly benefiting from lockdowns at the expense of the poor and middle class and legacy businesses.
Yeah, and that fact is undisputable for sure. So let me shift gears a minute, Jeffrey, because in the time we have left, I want to talk a little bit about monetary policy, which we started to talk about at the end of the first segment. The Fed this year, in response to all this, has printed like over $3 trillion. That's the stuff of which banana republics are made. I think that the operating deficit was $3.3 trillion this year. How do you see this monetary policy response affecting our average listener moving ahead?
The Federal Reserve, if we stop locking down, which I think we very well may. I think Trump's going to win, and I think we're going to end all lockdowns by the holidays. If that happens, the Fed needs to get busy and get a lot of sponges out to sop up all this liquidity, or else we're going to be facing a tremendous problem. The difficulty is they may not want to sop up all this liquidity because I think we're facing a serious. I think it's coming. Massive liquidation of real estate in large cities like New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Denver, Chicago. I think it's going to be a disaster because we're seeing tremendous demographic. Again, Dennis, as I'm talking to you, I almost can't believe I'm saying these things. Do you understand what I mean? This whole thing seems like a nightmare. But we're seeing gigantic population movements out of the large cities into the suburbs. And that's why the real estate markets are so hot right now, not because people are buying into cities because they're feeling prosperous, because they're desperately trying to sell their properties out of cities and move into the countryside. But the properties aren't selling because, and that's why you're not seeing prices depressed, because depressed prices are final prices, right? But real estate that's on sale, that's not selling, is not going to register as deflation. So the liquidation of real estate, I think, is going to be a huge issue in the first quarter of next year, and the Fed would have to be pretty brave to sop off up all this liquidity in the midst of a real estate crisis, which I think we're going to see in the first half of next year.
So do you think that inflation is imminent, or at least in things, I mean, we're already seeing food price inflation, bicycles, used car prices, and yet we're seeing, deflation. Obviously, we talked about hospitality and travel and a lot of those industries. Mm-hmm. How do you see this whole inflation, deflation thing playing out?
Well, Dennis, I think, thank you for asking this question. I think we need to upgrade our understanding of inflation. In the past, we used to think of an inflation as being just an index number. You take rising prices, declining prices, combine them into one thing and spit out a number. The world's gotten a little more complicated. We're going to see dramatic price increases in some sectors and then deflationary pressure in another. And it's almost at this point pointless to try to aggregate those into a single number that we call inflation. I think we have to look at the regular everyday price index. The American Institute for Economic Research calculates its own thing called the Everyday Price Index. That's something to watch, not the CPI. And then and to disaggregate it. So you look at consumer goods on one hand, real estate on the other, technology on the other. You're going to see opposite trends in opposite directions. Lots of businesses rising up, other businesses collapsing. It's going to be very difficult to follow, but I think we're in for a very, very seriously rough time of it. Professions are changing. People are bailing out of the arts, out of hospitality, and trying to get into other sectors of life. The amount of disruption that these lockdowns have caused is going to lead to a huge disaster in the future. Dennis, sometimes I think, you're very sophisticated from an economic point of view. You love economics, you studied it, you know it, but that's not true for a vast number of intellectuals, and it's not true for a large part of the American public. I think what's about to happen is we're going to get a big fat lesson in economics. And I just hope we learn something from it and don't forget it for the future.
Well, that is a good place to end it. My guest today has been Mr. Jeffrey Tucker. I would encourage you to check out his new book, Liberty or Lockdown. I found it on Amazon. He is the editorial director for the American Institute for Economic Research. And Jeffrey, always a pleasure to catch up with you. I can't believe how fast a 24-minute interview goes, and I would love to have you back down the road.
Thank you, Dennis. You take care, my friend, and hang in there.
Hey, you do the same. We will return after these words.
You are listening to RLA Radio. I'm your host, Dennis Tubbegren. Glad you decided to listen in today, and thanks again to Jeffrey Tucker for joining us on today's program. In the first segment of today's program, I talked about the fact that the Federal Reserve, and not just the Federal Reserve, but many other central banks around the world, are engaging in money creation. The Fed calls it quantitative easing, but essentially it's money creation. And already this year in 2020, the Fed has created as much money as they did from 2008 to 2020. So this money creation is accelerating. And in the first segment, I repeated the words of economist Herbert Stein, who said, if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. Well, money printing, history teaches us, always stops, and it stops either reactively or proactively. Now, in this segment, I just want to share with you some numbers. And I ran across a chart about a week ago when I was putting together a client update webinar. And incidentally, if you don't yet have the Your RLA app, go to Retirement Lifestyle Advocates and download the app. You can actually get access to and see this chart that I am referring to. Well, the chart really gave us some perspective on world asset and debt levels. How big are certain markets? How much money actually exists? And the biggest market by far, by a long shot, a long ways, was the derivative market. According to the Bank of International Settlements, the derivative market was approaching $560 trillion at the end of 2019, and there are many reputable sources out there that say the number is closer to $1 quadrillion. Now, some of you listening to this may say, what is a derivative and how is it going to affect me? Well, a derivative is essentially a bet between banks. Now, a derivative, when you define the word, that is a security that gets its value from or has a value that is derived from another security. That's where the name derivative comes from. But in this context, it's really a bet between banks, and banks will issue credit default swaps, which are a derivative, and basically a credit default swap is an insurance policy between banks. Now, it's important to note this is an unregulated and unreserved insurance policy. Much of the bailout that occurred back in 2008 to the financial system, to the banks, was due to derivatives that weren't backed up. Well, that problem that cast the financial system into turmoil and caused then Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson to get on television and say, unless I get a big pile of money by noon today, the financial system as we know it will fail. Well, that whole problem has gotten worse. And $1 quadrillion is huge exposure, assuming that number is correct. Now, when I throw out the term $1 quadrillion, that is a number that's very hard to wrap your head around. So let me try to give you an illustration that will put it into perspective. Let's start with $1 trillion. That's about 1/27th of the national debt. If you have $1 bills and stack them the thin way, flat side on flat side on flat side, and you were to stack $1 trillion $1 bills, the pile of $1 bills that you would have would be 67,866 miles tall. That's $1 trillion. That's a quarter of the way to the moon. Well, U.S. government debt is 27 times that. Now, if you take a look at a quadrillion dollars is 1,000 trillion. If we take the same stack of $1 bills, we now have a stack of $1 bills that is 67,866 miles tall. Now, the distance between the Earth and the Sun is known as an astronomical unit, and it's about 93 million miles, so a quadrillion dollars is 75% of an astronomical unit, if you can get your head around that. Now, taking a look at other global debt that exists, that's approaching 300 trillion. So between global debt and derivatives, if it all hit the proverbial fan, we have about a $1.3 quadrillion problem. The Fed's balance sheet is $7 trillion. So the bottom line is this: when you start to compare those numbers, it's going to be at some point impossible to create enough money to solve the problem, and you'll reach a tipping point at some point prior to creating that much money where the populace says, hey, wait a minute, maybe I'd be better off not holding this currency. I might be better off in something tangible. History teaches us that often occurs. Now, when we look at a tangible asset market, let's start with the gold market. The World Gold Council says that if you add up the value of all the gold that exists in the world, at today's prices, you have somewhere between $10 and $11 trillion worth of gold. If you add up all the silver that exists, it is by comparison a tiny market, only about $44 billion. Cryptocurrencies are now about 5 times the size of the silver market, about $244 billion. So by comparison, very, very small markets. Now let's take a look at just paper asset markets. The total value of stocks, about $100 trillion. The total value of bonds around the world, about $250 trillion. The total value of real estate around the world, about another $250 trillion. So those three markets are about $600 trillion. Let's just assume that folks that own those assets, stocks, bonds, and real estate, decide they want to have another 2% of their portfolio in metals. Well, 2% of $600 trillion is $12 trillion. And that's $12 trillion moving into a total combined market that is less than $11 trillion. That is why I believe that many folks should consider adding tangible assets to their portfolio. The writing, to me, is on the wall. Now, you want to make sure it's right for you, and that's why we have developed the Your RLA app, the Your Retirement Lifestyle Advocates app. You can download the app and get a lot of free resources. All you have to do to get the app is visit our website at retirementlifestyleadvocates.com. The website, again, is retirementlifestyleadvocates.com. That will give you access also to the chart that I just talked about. It will get you our weekly newsletter as well as the podcast and access to our client webinar, and all that can be replayed whenever you'd like. So just go download the app at retirementlifestyleadvocates.com, and you'll get access to all those resources. As always, I appreciate you tuning in. Hope you got something you can use. I'll be back again next week.